How do we know that the Qur'an that we have in our possession today is in fact the authentic, original Qur'an revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him? Well, I'm going to offer you two irrefutable arguments. Now, before I get to those two, let me first say that Muslims do themselves a major disservice when they rely on the hadiths in order for them to argue for the authenticity of the Qur'an. One of the problems with hadith, before I get to the two proofs, is that the hadiths insist that the Prophet was illiterate or unlettered. Now that negates the words of Allah, of the Qur'an, where the Qur'an, we know that God in the Qur'an instructs the Prophet to read. There's a very prominent verse in the Qur'an where the Qur'an or Allah instructs the Prophet Muhammad, read. And the word for read is iqra. It's a word in the Qur'an. And it is addressed to the Prophet. Now it is illogical for the Creator of the universe to act in a sarcastic or in an illogical or in a facetious way in a matter such as this. And so we must assume, based on that verse, that the Prophet was able to read. And that notwithstanding the fact that the Prophet was a businessman, was a recognized merchant in his community, that it would be unthinkable for him not to read. Then also that he would instruct the captives to teach 10 Muslims to read and write, and not himself take advantage of that. So the Prophet definitely, and as the Shia section of the Muslim world has always asserted, the Prophet could read and write. And one thing that we must eliminate from our collective psyche as Muslims, and we must never ever entertain it again, is that the Prophet was illiterate or unlettered. Now the confusion could come in with the word ummi, because ummi could be translated as illiterate, but there is a different sense to the word ummi, which means unschooled. But unschooled is not illiterate. Unschooled could also mean unindoctrinated. And so when the Qur'an refers to the Prophet Muhammad as ummi, it simply reads that he was unadulterated, unindoctrinated, uncontaminated by the existing false ideologies that he grew up with in his society. So point number one, we must reject the hadith literature that takes the Prophet as being unlettered or illiterate. The second point from the hadith literature that we must reject is this cumbersome and completely unorganized process of preserving and reproducing the original text of the Qur'an. Because there are so many hadiths that speak about the Qur'an went from one woman's possession to this caliph and that caliph, and then they burned the copies. These are all in the hadith literature. The Qur'an itself states very, very unambiguously that this book was recorded by incorruptible scribes. That is in the book. You go and do the research. The book itself, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had a number of secretaries that were always at hand when a piece of revelation was received. Of course, prominent amongst them was Imam Ali, his son-in-law. And so he had virtually in his own home, next door he had his son-in-law who was always there to record these new revelations. But now coming to the two main arguments. The first main argument is, you see, the Qur'an was revealed over 23 years, and every piece of that was maintained and preserved. The Qur'an came down in small bits, 10 verses here, 2 verses there, and like that. Now if you go back and if you consider that it was revealed over 23 years, there is no way that somebody could record a work of non-fiction and not undergo some sort of revision of his earlier ideas. There is no way that the Qur'an could have any contradiction, not have any contradictions, if it was done by a man over 23 years, and if it was not interpolated or changed over the years. because that would certainly have caused some form of contradiction. So that is the first point. Now, I've written works over the past 23, 30 years, and I can tell you very honestly, the works that I've written 20 years ago, 23 years ago, half of those I would like to revise. No man, no human being can do a work of non-fiction over 23 years and not have the need to revise earlier words. The Qur'an is unrevised. It is as it was revealed over 23 years with zero contradictions. And yes, you can challenge it. You can show me some contradictions. It will turn out that those are not contradictions. And you can definitely put that in the comments if you like. The second proof that it has to be preserved is the absolute chaos and mayhem that broke out shortly after the death of the Prophet. Everyone is in agreement that Islam underwent the most severest of division and civil strife soon after the Prophet's passing away. In fact, the very first split was on the leadership issue. And right at the start, the leadership divided into two. Those who supported the family, Imam Ali and the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and those who supported Abu Bakr, the Qurayshite Caliph, and those who went with him. But there were also further splits, like between the Ansar, the citizens of Medina, and the old aristocracy of Mecca. And the citizens of Medina felt extremely snubbed by the aristocracy of Mecca when they, in the form of the Umayyads and Uthman, became more powerful than the people that in fact gave their city to the Prophet and in fact fought in almost every battle. So there were these divisions that beset and that plagued the Muslim world, not right there at the outset after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and continued uninterruptedly for another number of decades. In fact, the first century could almost be completely seen in utter chaos and division. There were no less than 2 or 3 of these major civil wars. The Muslim world, in fact, divided into 4 centers of power. And at times, the Umayyads ruled, and then they were challenged for about 10 years by the Zubayrids, Ibn Zubayr, who is not a Shi'i, but was actually a breakaway sect from the Sunni majority, proto-Sunnis. Then some of the parts of the world were under Shi'i control, or proto-Shi'is again, because Shi'ism had not been established, but politically they were aligned to Imam Ali. And that would have been Kufa. Today it's broadly, or you can say Baghdad. So the Muslim world fragmented into Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, Basra. There was also communities in Yemen that were extremely Shia orientated. So that is the story of the Muslim world for the first 100 years. Now you tell me, out of all those centers, out of all those mutually conflicted centers, one standard text emerged. People who were at war, who were killing each other, people who invented and fabricated hadiths. In all those centers there were hadith fabrications going, it was rife. But the one text that never was disputed by any of those, the one text that was never disputed was the text of the Holy Qur'an. And so that, my friends, as the second point. The first is the lack of contradiction. The second point would be the unanimity amongst warring camps on the text of the Qur'an. But amongst all those warring factions, one text came out, and never ever did a rival version emerge. And that kind of warring situation continues right up today. The present day Shi'i component of the Muslim world, which numbers about 10%, have an absolute have a Qur'an that is in absolute agreement with the Sunni. Yes, they all have hadiths and things that say, yeah, the Qur'an was different. But the actual sacred text that Muslims all agree on is one standard text. Now that is enough for me. I mean, as a scholar, as a person who has a master's level qualification in research, for me that fact is the most powerful fact that supports the Qur'an. The division amongst the Muslims from the word go right up till now. And there is no question that that really ends up being the most powerful endorsement of the authenticity of the Holy Qur'an. Now, I'm not even talking here about the Birmingham manuscript going back to the time of the Prophet. I'm not talking about the Sana'a manuscript going back to a few years, 100 years, 200 years after the Prophet, because that would even lend more credibility to the point that if you take a random piece of the book and it agrees 100% with today's Qur'an, that is massive endorsement.